What we have now, our next presenter is Dr. Kurtycz, who all of you know already, I'm sure. In fact, when I spoke about the symposium in Washington, you were the first one to run up and say, I'm coming to Kingly Greece. Unfortunately, guess what happened along the way? This pandemic set things back, but nevertheless. Recently retired professor of the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. He has served as the medical director of the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene, the state's public health laboratory. He received his medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1976, has served his pathology residency at the University of Wisconsin in 1985, and assumed the directorship of the UW-Madison Cytology Lab and School of Cytotechnology from Dr. Stanley Einhorn. 1987, he established the University of Wisconsin FNA service, the UW Cytopathology Fellowship. He also directed the General Pathology course for the University of Wisconsin of Medicine. National service, my goodness, the list is long. Secretary-Treasurer of the American Society of Cytopathology, past president of the ASC in 2020. He has served 7 years as a member of Cytopathology Test Development Committee in the American Board of Pathology, has served 9 years on the American Society of Clinical Pathologists Board, Registry for Cytology, 7 years on the CAP Cytopathology Committee, and is the current president of this very same society that's putting on this event. Co-author of numerous publications, associate editor of the Milan System, associate editor of the International System for Reporting Serious Fluid Cytopathology, 25 years National Ski Patrol, and something I did not know, a second Dan World Taekwondo. Don't mess with this man. Dr. Daniel, thank you for being here.
It's my privilege to talk today about Hashime Murayama, who worked with Dr. Papanicolaou for many, many years. Hashime Murayama was his artist, born in 1879, and lived, as you've heard, till 1954. His life was molded by a series of national and international events. There was a series of devastating events going on in China that affected the whole Eastern Hemisphere. There was the end of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration that I'll talk a little bit more about. And then there was World War II and the Executive Order 9066 that sent many Japanese immigrants to internment camps. There's no financial conflict of interest. All the images used are public domain or usable by educators, especially those from National Geographic. So the 1860s were not only a time of armed conflict for the United States on our Civil War, but another civil war with revolutionary societal change raged in Japan. The conglomeration of events during the Meiji Restoration was a response to contact with the West and what was going on in China. In China, there had been 2 opium wars, where the Qing dynasty and the European powers, France and England, had fought to force the use of opium. And then in 1850, there was the Taiping Revolution, where 20 million Chinese died and another 30 million were displaced. And it was a series of events as horrendous as World War I, but we had not heard as much about it, at least in the West. The Meiji Restoration saw the end of 260 years of the feudal Tokugawa shogunate and saw the emperor restored to power, essentially, or at least a central government with the emperor at its head. The last battle of the Restoration was in 1877, termed the Satsuma Rebellion, and that was 2 years before Murayama's birth. During the Restoration, the capital of Japan moved from Kyoto to Edo, and centers of learning and industrialization were created in Tokyo. Japan had to modernize. They had to move fast, quick, before they were subject to the same sort of forces that they saw and feared in China. In Kyoto, half the population left, and they went elsewhere. And there was great worry in that city about the loss of traditional culture. So just as an orientation, Kyoto is here, and Tokyo you can see is far to the east. One of the things in response that the city fathers of Kyoto did was petition the imperial government for a way to preserve the traditional arts of painting and ceramics and weaving, and the emperor allowed the generation of a Kyoto City University of the Arts, then called the Imperial College of the Arts, on the grounds of the palace in Kyoto. The emperor has a palace both in Kyoto and in Tokyo. This was Murayama's alma mater. Not only did it generate people who knew traditional arts, but also in their desire to modernize and learn about the West, the impressionistic, the realistic, the romantic arts from the West were incorporated in the education. Around that time, around the 1900s, I should say, a surge of immigration occurred. The Japanese government wanted people to go abroad such that they'd bring back techniques to Japan. 400,000 left and over 200,000 to the United States. This document is an imperial Japanese passport. This comes from my wife's family. Fukukoba came across with 2 babes in arms, 2 children, to San Francisco in 1905. And of course, or excuse me, in 1906. Murayama came in 1905. 1906, she got there just after the San Francisco earthquake. There's family history of it being very difficult to find housing. Murayama came over the West Coast, but then he got a position at Cornell. And he prepared teaching materials, publication materials, generated microscope drawings, and made models for their educational purposes. Murayama also got involved in the local arts scene in New York, and he had exhibits at the Met. He did one that's notable in this historical record about Japanese armor. In 1910, Nao Makino, his sensei's or his teacher's daughter, joined him in New York, where they were married, and this was followed by the birth of 2 sons, Ken in 1911 and Tsutimi or Sammy in 1919. Because of the extant legal system, Hashime could not become a citizen in the US, but was still eligible for the draft, and this is his draft card. His 2 sons, though, born in the US, were citizens. So this is a picture of the Murayama family, with the elder Murayama being on the left, and Tsutimi or Sammy next, and Nao, and then Ken. First and foremost, Hashime considered himself an artist, and in the 1920 census, he filled in artist in the profession section. And then in 21, he was hired by National Geographic as its first staff illustrator and resident artist. And over the next 2 decades, he produced numerous works which were featured in National Geographic and other scientific publications. He did color images of birds, insects, aquatic animals, frequent highlights of the journals, and presented a number of exhibitions of natural history art. That you can still get some of the copies of these publications through eBay and Etsy, and you can see here he got top billing, and his byline is also over here. Color images were hard to come by, right? Here's Hashime Murayama at work. I'll show you a couple images first. So this is one of his goldfish pictures, and it's a style called romantic because there's highly detailed, but it clearly is not a photograph. It's not realistic, but it certainly brings the detail and the essential features of his subject. He was known to be Japanese stereotyped and be very exacting in what he did. He would count the scales on these things and then measure them and proportionally reduce them to put in the paintings. And so, and his art is amazing. Color printing was a problem in those days, right? It was not easy. It was very expensive to generate color prints in anything. And so artists had not only to know about the drawing or the painting, but had to understand paper, had to understand the printing process. And it was essentially lithography, at least since the late 1800s. You'd have to take an image, you'd photograph it, then you'd have to use filters to separate that image into its cyan, magenta, yellow, and black images. And then you would impress those images, etch those images on first limestone and then zinc plates. And then you'd use ink to absorb on those etchings and then put them on paper, highly registered form. And so it was expensive. It was a real job. And that's why there were a lot of printers. That's why we didn't get black and white images off out of our journals until relatively late, because the printing process were still expensive. Nowadays, of course, it's all gone digital, and it's much cheaper to produce images. And also, we get 5 million now catalogs in our mailboxes full of bright, wonderful colors, and it's very cheap for them to do it, although I put those mostly in circular files. So the art didn't all go one way, that it wasn't only the Japanese that were trying to learn Western art. The paintings, especially the woodblock type ukiyo-e, things that came from Hosogai and other people from Japan, were widely appreciated by Western artists, especially the Impressionists. So people like Monet and Manet, Degas, Van Gogh, they bought these things up and then impressed them to the degree that they used them in the art. The first one here is La Japonaise, which is, I'm mispronouncing it, but this is Camille, Monet's first wife. And then there are just a series of studies of the water lily garden that Monet created in Giverny. And it's a wonderful place to go. I'd never been impressed with how beautiful a layout of flowers could be. And here's my wife, Tina, on Monet's bridge. And it's stunning, it's emotional. Here are some more detail. These are 3 squirrelfish. And this one impressed me because I used to do a lot of diving in the Caribbean. And so, very exacting. Sergeant Majors, this famous angelfish of various forms, a couple more. This one, for collectors of Murayama's work, the Portuguese Men of War is well known, and then the 6 seahorses. He also did whatever National Geographic needed, and so there were other types of drawings. His first love always seemed to be the aquatic forms. Most of the writing relative to Hashime Murayama relate to his experience during World War II and what happened to Japanese immigrants. In 1921, he was just after Pearl Harbor in 41, he was either fired from or left National Geographic under unclear circumstances, with the rising tide of resentment against and fear relative to those of Japanese ancestry. There is a predisposition to interpret historical events through a modern lens and not through the context of the time. But I'd like you to remember that there were parochial narratives all over the world. There was ethnic isolation all over the world. Communication was much more primitive. The best thing was AM radio. There was panic over events what was going on in the Western Pacific, in the Philippines, in China, in Southeast Asia. Phenomenal deaths were being recorded daily, and there was great fear that imperial forces would show up on the West Coast. There was one incident called the Nihao incident, which added to that. Now, certainly there was an abrogation of the rights of citizens born in the United States, and the immigrants weren't treated well. The treatment of Japanese was stimulated by that paranoia, and this incident, after the second wave of aerial attack on Pearl Harbor, one Japanese aircraft crashed on Nihao Island, which is a small island in the Hawaiian chain. The pilot was captured, survived. He convinced a Japanese immigrant and his wife to help him escape. The pilot was subsequently killed, and the helper committed suicide. And the single event, was used as partial justification for internment in Executive Order 9066. This is Topaz Camp in Delta, Utah. Picture sometime 43, 44, and typical of the internment camps that were used for those of Japanese nationality during World War II. As it says, 122,000 men, women, and children were forcibly moved to Ten Assembly Center, and 70% of those were citizens. In Delta, Utah, the museum that they have is one of its major features, and it's called the War Relocation Center Museum. My wife's family met at Topaz, or my wife's mother and father. And so without Topaz, there would be no Tina, but nonetheless, it traumatized the mother and a lot of things related to those 3 years that she was in camp. In the museum, they have a number of exhibits. Surprisingly, for such a small town, it's excellently done. There are a lot of artifacts of what they created. They redid their whole society inside that camp. There was music, there was art, there was education, a lot of crafts, and things like seashells would make these bouquets. They used to take wire from screens, coat it with tissue paper, stain it, and do weaving, whatever they could get their hands on. The museum has all those artifacts, and we've gone there once, but it's a little trip from Salt Lake. So the elder Murayama was interned in 42 and 43 with his family on suspicion of espionage, and once was detained for 5 months on Ellis Island. It's unclear if his activities of his son Ken had anything to do with it. His son Ken had gone back to Japan and was a journalist and worked for Dome, which was the Japanese national press. And it may have put the family under increased suspicion, don't know. But Murayama was saved for longer internment by Dr. Papanicolaou and the faculty of Cornell, who first, after he left National Geographic, they offered him a position to illustrate cancer cells. And Papanicolaou appealed to the Federal Alien Enemy Hearing Board on the basis that Murayama's work was of national importance. There was no one else who could do what he could do, and he alone had the skill set to perform the work. Papanicolaou managed to gain the support of the U.S. Attorney General, Francis Biddle, who secured Murayama's freedom. And the three works of note: 1943, diagnosis of uterine cancer, the hard to come by 1948 epithelia of women's reproductive organ, and the major work that occurred in every laboratory was the Atlas of Exfoliative Cytology. There was recognition, of course, as Dr. Ciantonio has gone over, that prior to the cytologic method, cervical cancer diagnosis was by biopsy, which is an operative procedure. And of course, they had to use a speculum to open the vaginal vault, use tenaculum, those clamps with points to pull down the cervix, to look at it and then biopsy it. Such a procedure is not suitable for mass screening. And so it came to be that the aim of the cytologic method was to use a simple, inexpensive technique with wide sampling to detect both early and advanced lesions. Colposcopy, which many have touted, didn't really arrive in the US until the 1960s. And it had a somewhat dark history because although developed by Hintzman in 25, it was done in Germany, and it had been used in the concentration camps, people who were unwilling. So Murayama, when he was given the task of looking at Papanicolaou's slides, paid attention to the objectives of the PAT method. There are crisp nuclear profiles. There's chromatin detail. There's cytoplasmic transparency and functional differentiation of the cytoplasm, the colors being imparted by metabolic activity or pH. And also you were already shown this. This is an example. These plates are examples of what was in the book, and this is how he described them, that they gave you a line, they gave you the figure numbers, and you went over and looked at the cells. And the detail is remarkable. I was fortunate enough to get to work on a number of books lately with other people's images, photographic images and do some color balancing, and so became interested in Murayama, and again, I'm astonished. So, in the era before generally available color photography, Murayama's images were used for training and for reference. They were universally present in these laboratories. This is the State Laboratory of Hygiene in 1952. And I want to point out this lady, Norma Arvold, who was a med tech. Norma went to see Dr. Papanicolaou in 47 at Cornell, got trained, brought the technique back to Wisconsin, and then 10 years later set up an early school of cytotechnology. This is Norma in the foreground, and Norma is especially important to me because Norma, being the quintessential person with a pencil in the ear and a ruler in her hand, taught me and many other residents a love of cytopathology. So, you know, getting our fingers wrapped and doing the right thing was Norma's job, and I've always appreciated her. Murayama not only did cytologic images, but in the epithelia book, there's plenty of histology. There's a drawing on the left, and on the right, he did take photographs, black and whites, and then colorize them, and then they were put into the book. And there are 4 images of uterine prolapse where you can see the keratinization, and then on the bottom left, bottom right, excuse me, there's a carcinoma in situ. The result, as you all know, is that there was a remarkable decrease in deaths from uterine cancer. Here, from 2007, American Cancer Society showing an 82% decrease in the death rate from from uterine cancer. They did not separate cervical from endometrial at the time, but this is an important graph. So Murayama in the 1954 atlas was responsible for most of the images in this most famous text, and this incorporated not only cervical cytology, but they were starting to explore other sites, and so this is breast, both benign and malignant breast cells. This was published in the year of his death, and as was mentioned, he never got to see it. He never also got to go back to his first art, the naturalistic art, and which I believe was a disappointment to him. But he was in the midst of a crusade. Hashime Murayama lived through turbulent times, and through technical skill and passion for his work, rose above those times. He should be remembered for his art and his accomplishments, not only for what he suffered as an immigrant here. He is directly responsible for producing graphic materials that resulted in saving thousands of lives and contributing to the advancement of anatomic pathology. So, thank you very much for your attention.